Sort of repeat a lecture that I had done years ago about presidential rankings of historians, and it was actually sort of fortuitous because recently there was a ranking that came out. I don't know if you've read about this, heard about it. It was a survey of presidential greatness. And the only reason that that made news is because somebody came at the bottom of presidential greatness who's running for president. You got a 50-50 guess on which one it is. And so it made news across the board with, of course, people dividing along party lines on whether the survey was great or not great. So when we look at, as historians, when we start trying to judge what a president does, if they're great or not, there's always several questions. One, do presidents exist because they're great men, or do the times that they're in give them opportunities to be great? So, for example, I would argue that if Abraham Lincoln didn't have the Civil War, would we remember Abraham Lincoln? No, he probably would have been thrown in there with everybody else as probably a one-term president. That tended to be the trend since Jackson. Everybody served one term and disappeared. So it's a good question on whether or not would there have been a Franklin Delano Roosevelt? What had he done if there hadn't been World War II? Right? These are all things that we have to look at when we talking about presidents. So you met Lee Staples, my colleague from TCC, and we actually sit around and talk these things through often. And there's a couple things that Lee, and I'll use some of his ideas, is that when he's looking for a great president, or what makes him great, he's got some qualifications to it. One, to get up in the greats, you got to serve 2 terms. Because if you don't, that means you got kicked out by voters, right? And that's a repudiation of the public if you're a one-term president and you get kicked out. So when we look over at the C-SPAN rankings of great presidents, and I can look at it right here, the top 10, there are no one-term presidents there. They're all 2-term presidents. And if I were to flip over and take a look at the bottom of the bottom 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, bottom 13 are all one-term presidents. There are no 2-term presidents in that list. So you've got to at least win 2 terms usually. I think the only exception might be James K. Polk. James K. Polk ran for president in 1844, saying that he would annex Texas, he would settle the Oregon question, whether Oregon was going to be ruled by Britain or the United States, and he was going to lower the tariff, and he was going to acquire land from Mexico. And that would be it. He'd serve 1 term. And guess what he did? He served 1 term. He goes, yep, I did everything I wanted to do, I'm leaving. So 1-term presidents, he looks pretty good on that regard. Of course, he did die 3 months later. Because if you read his diary, which I have, it says, tomorrow I'm going to go do this. And I go, no, there is no tomorrow, James. There is no tomorrow. It doesn't mean that 1-term presidents can't move up a little bit. I think people look fondly back on George Bush Sr.'s presidency, right, as a time, sort of an idyllic time that you had this president who was very classy, who was very well spoken, and people look back at that. And George Bush Sr. did accomplish some things. I think the Americans with Disabilities Act is one of the great pieces of legislation of the 20th century. So 2-term presidents, that's one. Another one that Lee and I both talked about was, did you get to pick your successor? Right? Did you handpick your successor? So, let's take a look. Jefferson did, right? Monroe did. Jackson did. Lincoln didn't because, you know, yeah.
Circumstances.
The circumstances got in the way. I will say not FDR because circumstances got in the way, he died. But Teddy Roosevelt did. Teddy Roosevelt said, I want William Howard Taft. Got him. Ronald Reagan did. He wanted George Bush, right? And so if you can handpick your successor, that's another sign that people really like you as president and they're wanting to continue that legacy of president. And although I think that if you look at most of those presidents who came after like Taft or George Bush, I think people think 12 years is enough of anything, because most of them lost re-election, right? They didn't make it. Taft got beat by Wilson and Bush got beat by Clinton. So those are a couple of the things that we look at as presidents. We look at what's the time, the context they're in, and did they win 2 terms? And we don't look necessarily on whether or not the legislation they passed was good or not good. It's whether or not they got the legislation passed. Because we can look back at Lyndon Johnson, for example. Lyndon Johnson got a lot of legislation passed, right? Medicaid, Medicare, the Great Society. And some people, that's come under fire in the present day, but it was major legislation that he got passed, right? Obama got insurance reform, medical insurance reform with Obamacare. Whether you like it or not, it was a dream of people that suggested that from Harry Truman on. They said, we'd like to see some sort of national health care system. And so he did get it passed. Whether it's been successfully won or not, well, we can debate that all we want. So I think getting your legislation passed, and sometimes it's, did you do any harm? And the reason I say that is that William Henry Harrison is going to be president for 30 days. He gets out, he gives an inaugural speech for almost 2 hours in the rain, gets pneumonia, and he dies. He's ranked higher than other presidents because he didn't do anything, but he did no harm, right? So I'm always amazed that if you're the guy that you're getting beat by the guy that only lived for 30 days, it's probably a problem, I'm going to think. So if we look at characteristics of great presidents, I think most of your great presidents, in fact, most of your successful presidential candidates are always very positive in their outlook, right? There's not an I in their language. They don't use I. It's always we as a people, we together, America can. I mean, people who say I, that's usually not somebody who's really thinking about what everybody wants, right? And we don't get those kind of presidents. It's always we. I think it's always important to have a sense of humor. Great presidents seem to be pretty good quippers. Abraham Lincoln, masterful storyteller. John F. Kennedy, very funny guy. Ronald Reagan, I think we all grew up with Reagan, knowing that Reagan was a very funny guy, right? Very good, and that maybe is training somewhat. So I think having a sense of humor is good. I think Lee and I and some other teachers, we're going to go to a conference doing a panel discussion on presidential humor. So, here's my question for you, and you'll be able to write this on the back of those things. Thinking about it, that you have to be, think about those qualifications, that you were a 2-term president, you won 2 terms, right? You accomplished something, whether it turned out to be good or bad. If I were to ask you, on the back there, give me your 2 greatest presidents. You 2. Just run down that back and then flip it around. Tell me who, in your opinion, who are your 2 greatest presidents? Give you a second to think about it. We'll see if you agree with the historians, because I got the survey of the historians up here. See what we think, and then we'll take a tour through the top 10 and the bottom 5. How about that?
I don't know if I spelled them right.
You did spell them right.
I didn't spell, I think I spelled them right. Can you turn it around?
Yeah, turn around. Interesting.
This has the advantage of if you've forgotten who you are.
At my age, that's problematic. Okay. A couple more. All right.
It's an interesting technique, by the way.
I find it fun when I'm like,
I mean, at least you sort of do force everybody to get involved.
yes, and someone come up with really good answers. All right. We know one person. I guess say who.
Just me.
And I couldn't tell you who my favorites are. All right. All right, so let's take a look at our votes. George Washington shows up twice, 3 times. Lincoln shows up twice. All right. The Bushes, senior, shows up. Are you junior or senior?
Oh, I'm junior, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Junior shows up twice. Thomas Jefferson shows up, and Reagan shows up twice. So, I mean, we have some commonality. Lincoln, Washington, Reagan, I will tell you, so far, you're doing really well. They're all, Jefferson, they're all in the top 10. They are in the top 10 of presidents. So, now, flip it around. I'm double checking my Eisenhower thing. Eisenhower might be in the top 10. Eisenhower is in the top 10.
I didn't spell it right.
I knew who you were talking about. Born where?
Where was he born?
Uh-huh.
Come on, darling, you're on the spotlight. I have no idea where.
Denison, Texas.
Oh, yeah, I've been there. I
Oh,
forgot
yeah,
about that.
Yeah, he's born. So now tell me your 2 worst presidents.
Ooh,
Oh,
it's gonna take some thought.
I know you want to put in more than 2.
Oh, I don't know if I should do this or not. Do I wipe this clean or what?
Yeah, wipe it off.
This could be controversial.
How controversial can it be with 6 of us in here, 7 of us?
What's the one that says, I am not a crook?
Nixon.
Nixon.
Okay.
All right.
You know, I am not political at all, so.
Well, you can be non-political and still judge
I'm
presidents.
not political at all. I never get any because it's too controversial. I don't like to be in the.
I love controversy. I thrive on it.
Yes, I know you do.
I know you won't like the second one, but by your criteria.
Well, you didn't get to pick a you didn't get to pick a successor.
That's true.
Of course, she suffered a stroke.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
That's
his
always-
wife picked the successor and it was her.
All right, let's just wait a second.
It has modern equity.
All right, so okay, so I've got 2 Woodrow Wilsons. I've got 1, 2, 3 Nixons. Okay. I've got 2 Jimmy Carters. I've got 2 Bidens, 1 Obama,
Let's see here, boy.
1 Trump,
I hate him.
1 Harding and Buchanan. Okay, so if I'm looking at the bottom, let's say we go for the bottom 5. Buchanan is in the bottom 5. Harding is not in the bottom 5. He's in the bottom 10 of presidents. Yeah, so he's near the bottom. As for your others, let's see. Nixon is in the bottom 12. Okay. Who else do we have here? Trump is in the bottom 5. And this is 2021, so there is no Biden.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
Although the survey of presidential greatness that just came out has him at 14. But it's awfully soon, right? Who knows what could go wrong? And so I never trust anything that for presidents that are recent. And you have Buchanan. Buchanan is the very bottom, according to the survey of presidential
good job,
greatness.
Jim.
So let me find out. Wait, I have Woodrow Wilson, right? You have a couple of Wilsons. Wilson used to be higher, but he's in the top 15. He is in the top 15. They have quite a legislative accomplishment. Okay, maybe. All right. So we've got this nice blend here, and of course it's often very political, right? I mean, depending on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's going to, especially for modern presidents, is certainly going to impact your view, right? So let's take a quick tour, first off, of our top presidents. Number 1 on our list, several of you put him, it's Abraham Lincoln. He is considered the greatest president. Probably because
The war.
the war, right? He keeps the Union together. He could have easily broken apart. He keeps the border states from jumping into the Confederacy, and is eventually able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Certainly, Lincoln is the kind of guy that grows into the presidency. And it doesn't help that he's a brilliant speechwriter, right? He's a great writer, he's a great storyteller. People love him. He's number one. And he's been number one for some time. I think he's been one since 2000. And they do it about every 10 years. So, well, every 7 years. So it's been about 4 times. He stays at number one. Number 2, several of you named him, Washington. Right, the father of the country, right? George Washington, of course, because what does Washington do as president?
He defined the role, really.
Yeah.
Yes, he
Set
defines the
precedents.
presidency. Yeah, he's the one that says, hey, I think 2 terms is enough,
Yeah.
and leaves, and that helps us. He's the one that creates the idea of a cabinet, right? He's the one that assumes debt and shows how we can establish our credit as a nation. He establishes foreign relations. He does a lot of that with the help of Alexander Hamilton, of course, as well. So he's number 2. Now, number 3, you had this down. I didn't know which one you had, but Franklin Roosevelt.
I like both of them.
Yeah, so Franklin Roosevelt, you can see why. How many times does he win?
Yeah.
Number?
4.
4,
Yeah.
right? And fundamentally changes everybody's view of the government. It fundamentally changes it. Because before, when the Great Depression hits, right, a third of the people are put out of work, who do people blame for the Great Depression?
What's his name? Hoover.
Themselves. Yes, they blamed their situation on themselves. They go, well, I should have saved more. You know, they didn't really expect a lot from the government. And then Franklin Roosevelt changes everybody's perception of the government. The government's supposed to do more. The government isn't supposed to allow a third of the workforce to go unemployed and do nothing about it, which was the history of the United States. Whether it was the Depression of 1836, the Depression of 1857, the Depression of 1873, the Depression of 1893. The government did nothing. And Roosevelt changes that, right? He changes that. And on top of that, what else does he do?
Oh, I can pick up
Wins World War II. What else can you ask, right? He wins World War II knowing that Americans don't like a lot of casualties. He certainly maneuvers it that way that we don't lose a whole lot of people. We lose the least amount of the major combatants, right? And unfortunately doesn't get to see the peace, but certainly creates a successful war. So yeah, I can see why he's up there. Teddy Roosevelt's next. He's usually number 4. Teddy Roosevelt, because what does he do?
He did the national parks.
He certainly expanded national parks.
He made the presidency more active.
Yes. Before that, there was, in the 1800s, there was something called the Whig theory of the presidency. And the Whig theory of the presidency said that presidents weren't supposed to do anything. They were just supposed to administer the law. That's it. Congress leads, presidents are managers. That's how it should work. Roosevelt gets in and says, forget that. He's going to take his bully pulpit and he's going to lead from the front. He sets the tone for the modern presidency, which is why some people on the far right don't like it. They just think that it was the worst thing ever. Let Congress rule. President shouldn't be issuing executive orders and things like that. So Roosevelt creates this very activist government with conservation. The Meat Inspection Act, after the passage of the Jungle, we've all read the Jungle probably, and the Pure Food and Drugs Act, right? So that when people were giving cough medicines that contained opium to children, they go, this will help your kids sleep. Yeah, I think so, because it is a dangerous drug. So yeah, Teddy Roosevelt. Interesting story about Teddy Roosevelt is that he serves, you know, he gets to be president, youngest president, the person to serve as president, when William McKinley is shot and killed, right, in 1901 in Buffalo. He wins in his own right in 1904, beating Alton B. Parker, the Democratic candidate, and in 1905 says, I won't run again. And he keeps his word. In 1908, he says, I've had a great time being president. See you all later. Here's my hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. He goes, I'm going off on safari to Africa. Whereas John D. Rockefeller supposedly quipped, let every lion do his duty, and hopefully eat Teddy Roosevelt. But then Teddy Roosevelt starts getting word that Taft isn't doing what he's supposed to do, which was not necessarily true. He comes back and he decides to run against Taft. When he starts that campaign, and there's going to be 4 candidates. There's going to be Wilson the Democrat. There's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. He'll run as a Bull Moose Party eventually. Taft is the Republican, and the socialist candidate, Eugene Debs, who will get almost 1 million votes at the time. But that's an interesting campaign because as soon as it starts, Roosevelt's getting out. A lot of you know this story. To start campaigning, and he's shot. A man shoots him. The bullet goes through his glasses case, through his speech, into his chest, and lodges underneath his rib. He helps tackle the guy, telling everybody don't hurt him, because he's clearly mentally deranged. And then Roosevelt goes and gives a 2-hour speech while bleeding from being shot.
Oh, my God.
Now, if we had a presidential candidate do that today, say, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and give the speech while I'm bleeding, would we think that's great?
No.
No, we'd probably think, what the heck? And so we still actually have this bloody shirt. It's always a great story. And
Under the Nolan Ryan.
yeah, the Nolan Ryan,
Ryan.
yeah, he's still the Nolan Ryan version of presidents. Yeah,
We were a
believe
different
it were.
country back then.
Yeah, it was a little bit different. But Teddy was always somebody who was always trying to prove himself anyway, right? His favorite word was manly. He used that word a whole lot.
Well, it might have had to do with his sickly childhood.
Yeah, he had a sickly childhood that he wanted to overcome, right? And he does, right? He boxes the heavyweight champion while president. But he dies, I think, flu in 1919. He was really sad that he didn't get to go to World War I, but the military wouldn't let him. They didn't like him. They didn't like him as a Rough Rider. They said, you're not going. They shut him out. His son, though, his son dies at D-Day of a heart attack. He's a general, and he collapses.
I think he lost his, is that his son or his grandson? So did he lose a son in the
It was
First
his-
World War?
it was-
Kermit Roosevelt died, I think, as
In a plane
he was
crash.
fighter pilot.
Yeah.
in
No, I don't think it was
World
his grandson, because this guy was in his 40s?
War. Yeah, it's a general,
And he's a general,
yeah.
generally speaking. So, I always find Teddy Roosevelt an interesting guy. Eisenhower's next. You know, here's how Eisenhower's a good case study. Because when Eisenhower left the presidency, people thought it was a failure. Right? It was terrible. It was Eisenhower had suffered. He wasn't all there.
Yeah.
He was this doddering old man, things that we hear today, right? Eisenhower was just sort of gone, doesn't know what's happening, he's out of touch. But about 30 years later, when his papers come out and all this stuff is declassified, we find that's actually the opposite. That, you know, that Eisenhower's behind the scenes, he's manipulating things, he's working to get things done. And so when you look at Eisenhower fighting the Cold War, passing one of the great pieces of legislation, the Interstate Highway Act, massive infrastructure that fundamentally changes how we live in the United States, I think that's why he gets a lot of credit for that. And of course he does stand up in civil rights, right? He sends the Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas, so those 9 students could get enrolled. Yeah. Harry Truman, I think Harry Truman's another example. Harry Truman was near the bottom for a while.
Yeah.
Not at the bottom, but he was considered a failed presidency because he was in the shadow of Roosevelt. But he did a lot of great things as well. I mean, he passed a lot of successful legislation. He ended World War II, right? He's there when we start doing containment, trying to contain the communists. So I think people look back at Truman and like his bluntness. He's a folksy guy. If you ever see the movie Dave, have you ever seen the movie Dave? Then go see the movie Dave. It's Kevin Kline. The president goes into a coma. So what they do is they go find somebody who looks just like the president, who's Kevin Kline, and he goes in and pretends to be the president, and he's a lot nicer, and everybody loves him, where they hated the other guy. But his vice president is Harry Truman, essentially. Yeah, haberdasher, hat salesman from Missouri. Yeah, I think people miss that. Thomas Jefferson is on our list. Jefferson's been holding steady at 7. I struggle with Jefferson. I really do. Because he certainly does the Louisiana Purchase, expands the United States by double. He writes the Declaration of Independence, but that's not when he's president. So I think people admire Jefferson for his intellect and his ingenuity. It's it's just sort of, it's hard for me to get around the fact that he's 43 years old, he's having relations with a 14-year-old girl who's enslaved, who cannot give consent. That always bothers me, it really does. And then, you know, he's enslaving people, that also sort of bothers me too, right? Things, but you have to look at it within the context of the times. And that's why he still ranks up really high, because we're going to see a lot of people who own slaves in this list that are still high up. Yeah, they're still high up. And Jefferson had a lot of accomplishments. The next one I also struggle with, and this is number 9, John F. Kennedy. Short-term president, right? 3 years. I think Kennedy gets in simply because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the launching of the moon space program. I think he was an inspirational leader. And this is where you have to separate sometimes, because Kennedy as a human being is not a very good human being. I mean, he's just not. Especially to his wife. He's just got a lot of issues as a human being. But I think that still, because he's the first modern president that works based on style instead of substance, he's good looking, he does very well on TV. When he debates Nixon, people who watched it on TV felt that Kennedy won. People who listened to it on radio thought Nixon won. So looks have something to do with it. And then I'm just going to round up our last 2. Number 9 is Ronald Reagan. I think we can see Reagan, right? What is it that Reagan does? Let me ask you that question. What is it that Reagan does that you think elevates him into the pantheon of the top 10 presidents?
I think Reagan pushing military strength as he did and making that a priority, and that was in the Air Force back when he was president. I think that led eventually and very quickly after his term to the collapse first of the Berlin Wall and in '91 the fall of Soviet communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I think those are big things. Plus, like you said, he was a very likable guy. You see him talking and he can easily joke and
I thought he
communicate
was a
with people.
we guy too. He very much spoke
Yeah.
to the American people, and didn't talk to Republicans or Democrats or whatever. He spoke about the American people.
And also, I think because most of us that were alive back then, I think it's pretty much everybody.
I think everybody was.
Maybe. The economy was so terrible when he came in that when he, as it kept increasing or improving throughout the 80s, I think that made a very positive impact on people. Maybe it's not something you can put your finger on and say he did this, and therefore we got that. But I mean, overall, the picture was as we got through the 80s, things were getting better and better.
Okay. Anybody else think, what do they think about Reagan? Anybody? I had some other Reagans on here. You had Reagan? Why Reagan?
Well, to me, he made the presidency seem more human, if that makes sense. Like, you could be your grandfather or your uncle.
Mhm.
I was a kid at the time, and he was easy to listen to. He did tell a lot of jokes about Democrats, so.
Yeah,
But
good
he
nature.
also got them to work together, both sides, so.
Yeah, I'm sort of along those lines that you're saying, is that when you look at when Reagan took office, the country had gone through Vietnam. It had gone through Watergate, right? And, you know, Carter's inspiration was saying that we're in a malaise. That's not really the best way to fire up people. But Reagan, if you remember the commercial that ran in the 80s, it's morning in America, right? And made Americans feel good about being Americans again, right? I think that's highly undervalued. I think the Cold War falling, that was inevitable. If anything's in history, it's inevitable, because if you go back to the Truman era, George Kennan said that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse upon itself. It's a society built on fear, and societies built on fear cannot last. And I think he was probably right about that at some point.
Yeah, I would say maybe Reagan has accelerated that.
Maybe,
You know?
yeah. And of course, you know, supplying arms to the Afghans right? How he accelerated it too, right?
It made good sense at the time.
Yeah, it certainly made good
In
sense at the time.
retrospect, yeah.
Well, but yeah, well, it did make good sense at the time. I think it's a policy that still holds up. So yeah, I think certainly when we look back at the Reagan years, especially for us to remember, we can remember somebody that was funny, laughing, very human, right? Certainly he could do that. And what made a great president often is that, and this is where we lack a lot of times, is your great presidents don't make fun of other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They make fun of themselves.
Right.
Remember the classic line, Reagan with Walter Mondale, when they're talking about Reagan's age, or they were talking about the age issue, and Reagan said he wasn't going to make a political points by talking about his opponent's youth and inexperience, because he's making fun of himself because of his age, right? And I think that's where your best presidents, they know that a self-deprecating humor is better than an insulting humor. It just doesn't fly. All right, number 10, according to C-SPAN's ranking of, with presidential historians, they have about 50 of them, is Barack Obama. Now, that might shock you a bit.
Yes, it does.
So, why Obama?
Yeah, I was just like, why? What was the reason for
Well, now no one has an answer for me?
Because he got his legislation passed?
He did get his legislation passed. He does win 2 terms. Number of scandals in the Obama administration?
None,
None. Number of people indicted? 0.
none,
Right? Does he look like a good family man?
yes.
Yes, right? Kids, seems like a good family man. Stability. The economy was roaring through the Obama administration, right? I say that, but I still, like you, I don't know how much the president has to do with that.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
But the thing is that when the economy goes bad, who do we blame?
President.
President.
Right.
Yeah.
When the economy is good, then presidents take credit for it.
Yeah, that's-
Right? And so when Obama left office, unemployment's at 4%, right? That's full employment. Stock market had been skyrocketing, right? Sure, whatever. That's probably why. Still, you don't know where he's going to land because I think that's too recent even to rank the guy. Because we're only 8 years apart out of it, right? And certainly historians can be idolizing too, right? They can let their emotions get in the way sometimes. Sure, I can get that. I understand that. I'm not sure if I would. I always don't like to rank presidents for the last 20 years or so. You know, keep them all out of the 21st century. But that doesn't stop other historians. I could be wrong. Now we get the top 10. Let's swing around to the bottom. All right, at the very bottom,
Buchanan.
James Buchanan. Why Buchanan? He constantly shows up at the bottom, by the way.
The biggest thing I remember about Buchanan, and I'm not a presidential historian, is just basically the country falls apart with Lincoln's election and Buchanan, because in those days the inauguration wasn't until March. Buchanan basically does nothing for 5 months.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that, sort of the paraphrase, he fiddles when Rome burns, right? South Carolina leaves, he goes, look, that's illegal, but I can't do anything about it. He was indebted to Southerners because they helped him get elected even though he's an Ohioan. He feels indebted to them. He dominates his cabinet with Southerners. I think that he does accelerate the beginnings of the Civil War. He doesn't do anything to stop it. And so I think that's one reason why he ends up at the bottom. Somebody you didn't mention that's second from the bottom often, or often is at the bottom, is Andrew Johnson. You remember Andrew Johnson?
Yes.
Yeah, that's,
Why is he at the bottom? First off, he's the first president to be impeached. Not convicted, right? They failed to convict him by 1 vote. He's the first one to be impeached. He was trying to restore white supremacy in the South. He was trying to strip African Americans of their rights. And so, with all of those things, he's going to rank at the bottom. He's been impeached, terrible policies. And it's interesting to note that they were fearful that when the election was held and Rutherford B. Grant wins, that there was talk that Johnson wasn't going to give up the presidency. And Congress was getting ready to call out the military to remove Johnson if he refused to leave. Now, he did leave. But there was all that rumor spreading in the Capitol building, and so Johnson always ranks near the bottom. Third from the bottom is Franklin Pierce. Our only, hang on, Connecticutian? He's the only person from Connecticut.
Yeah.
Whatever they call themselves, who knows?
That's why he ranks at the bottom, because there's no word for it.
I know, right? Connecticut? I don't know, I need to go look it up. I keep telling myself to do that. Franklin Pierce was considered the best looking president up until that time. They thought that was one good looking man. Now he's on that list because he allows for the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which then creates a civil war in Kansas over slavery, which accelerates the debate over slavery in the territory because the Kansas-Nebraska Act said you can bring slaves anywhere because they repealed the Missouri Compromise. And you can take them anywhere you want to. So it was seen as an expansion of slavery, and he allowed that to happen. So let's take a look. Step back for just a second. I'll come back to Pierce in a moment. The bottom three: Buchanan, Johnson, Pierce. The top one, Lincoln. What do they all have in common?
Middle of the 19th century.
What's going on?
Civil War.
Civil War, right? 3 of the presidents failed the test of the Civil War. Only one successfully passes that test, and that's Abraham Lincoln. And so you can argue, as I said earlier, is it the circumstances, the events that go around you that make you a great president or not, right? They all were tested by monumentous events of the time. 3 of them failed, 1 of them succeeded. If we hadn't had that, who knows, right? What if South Carolina decides they're not going to leave the Union and they're going to wait for the next president, see what happens? That certainly could have happened. South Carolina gambled, and South Carolina lost. So it's an interesting story about Pierce. Pierce wanted to be president. His wife didn't want him to be president. And when they ran, when he won, they had to take a train trip to Baltimore. The train derails and tumbles. Pierce's 10-year-old son is decapitated by the train, and his wife finds the body. And she will never forgive him for that.
Wow.
And he does tend to end up drinking a lot afterwards. So it's a real tragic story of Franklin Pierce and his presidency. And he was a person that his own party deserted him. They go, we don't want you back. That's always going to make you low. When your own party doesn't want you back, you're gone. And they replaced him with James Buchanan. So, number 4 on our worst presidents list as of 2021 is a presidential candidate right now. Trump.
Too soon.
Probably, I would say, to measure his accomplishments, probably too soon, but he's not going to move very high. Why?
No.
He's been impeached twice. He
He's
lost.
also a me guy, he's not a.
He's also a me guy, right?
Yeah.
I can solve it. It's not a very optimistic outlook, right? It does tap on a lot of pent-up frustration of American voters, a lot of pent-up anger of American voters. It does focus on a lot of that because people are fed up with a system that doesn't seem to solve problems. I think that's a natural reaction. And so they'll look back and like, how would you rank his handling of COVID? I mean, it's probably a mixed bag. I mean, Operation Warp Speed got us a vaccine in record time. But this resistance to mask and denying that it was actually going to be a problem probably hurt as well. I think that he could move up. I mean, the Abrams Peace Accords is certainly a plus. Didn't pass any major pieces of legislation and was defeated after 1 term. So could move up, but I don't think I see him moving up any further than, he'll always be in the bottom 50, in the bottom half. I don't think he'll get any higher because he's a 1-term president. Unless he
What if
wins,
he gets reelected?
if he gets reelected,
We're in terrible shape if he gets reelected.
if it's reelected, yeah, it's a good question because he would be the only the second president to win non-consecutive terms. Your first one is Grover Cleveland. But the difference is Grover Cleveland won the popular vote 3 times.
Wow.
He won the popular vote in 1884 when he won the presidency. He lost the popular vote in 1880. He won it in 1888, but lost the Electoral College vote. And then he won the popular vote again in 1892. So he's a president who won the popular vote 3 times. Donald Trump hasn't won the popular vote, right? He lost by 3 million votes the first time, and 7 million the second time. Although a swing of about 60,000 votes in the last election in key states would have given Donald Trump the election based on the Electoral College. So he could have won the presidency and lose the popular vote by 7 million votes. Yeah. So I'm just saying, as a political science guy, that's horrible. Because the number of countries.
Professor,
Yeah.
Bill Clinton never won a majority.
No, because you had 3 candidates.
Yeah, but I'm just saying.
Yeah. He won a plurality. He had the most votes.
No, he's had a plurality.
Yeah. We've had a lot of plurality presidents. Lincoln won a plurality.
Mhm.
He only had 38% of the
Because he
vote.
had like 3 Democrats.
What was I saying? Oh, it's a terrible thing. Because eventually what it does is it tells voters your vote doesn't count. Because in what other democracy does the winner of the popular vote not become the leader? So whoever wins, if it's Trump or Biden, whoever that is, I hope they get the popular vote. I think that provides stability to the system and people feel like their vote counts.
Yeah.
But Republicans have struggled with that since 1988. Since 1988, they have won the popular vote 1 time. 2004 with George Bush. Yeah. That's the only time. We need to make sure that whoever's winning is getting that popular vote. It makes people feel vested in the system. And I don't care who that might be. I want them to get that popular vote. Because we can't have it now that we'll have 4 times where in the recent history that the president doesn't get the popular vote and wins. And that's just, it's not good for democracy. Not talking about their policies or whatever. Okay, so some of you put some other names on it. I think it's fair that we should talk about it. Nixon's up on the list, certainly, because of Watergate, right? Also the secret war in Cambodia, that was probably a bad thing too. But he does do some good things. That's why he's probably not at the bottom. Any good things?
What did you do? I've been to his library and I still can't remember.
Well, strategic arms limitations with the Soviets, détente with the Soviets,
Open up China.
open up China. Don't forget the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act.
Establish the
And
EPA.
that's the
Seemed
EPA.
like a good idea at the time. We can talk about that.
You know, but if you go back to the 1960s, we had rivers in the United States catching fire,
Yeah.
right?
Coyotes.
Yep, and the Clean Water Act helped clean up the rivers, right? It helped clean up our streams. So I think, you might say, well, Nixon didn't really have a choice, decided, but it did get passed during his presidency. Yeah, so I think Nixon is up there. Some people had put Biden on there. Okay, so what makes Biden a bad president? I mean, if you put him on the list, I don't see it. You know,
I didn't put
I can't remember.
it.
I
Before
put
we
Biden
leave,
on there.
go ahead.
It's probably too soon if you're gonna do it by
Yeah.
categorize them, but I just don't like them,
Okay, that's okay. It's okay not to like certain people. I mean, I don't like Jefferson. It's like, okay.
I feel like he has trouble getting legislation through. I mean, we can talk about the division of the parties and partisanship, but that's been going for a while, and other presidents have gotten this stuff through. I just find
What about the CHIPS Act?
chips.
Yes, that provides money to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. They passed $55 billion
that
for
one
it.
recently.
That was 2021.
Yeah, that was
That was big. What about the Infrastructure Act? $1 trillion for infrastructure.
I think there's
Bipartisan.
a lot of boondoggle in that act. That's me. I can't say that that's the general evaluation of it, but I think a lot of it's.
Did he get it passed?
Huh?
Did he get it
He got
passed?
it passed.
Oh, okay, we're.
Did Trump say he was going to pass an infrastructure bill?
I don't remember.
Yes. Every week was infrastructure week. Did he pass one?
No.
No. Did Obama pass one? No. Did Bush pass one? No. But Biden did pass one, right? Maybe we were eventually forced to do it after a while. That could be the case. And the other problem is that when he passed it, it's $1 trillion, massive amount of spending. You end up then having inflation, which means that $1 trillion, in terms of real value, shrank. So, yeah.
The two are related, the fact that we're passing those kind of bills, budgets these days.
I don't know. And it's a good question. Is inflation caused by that? Because inflation is running wild in Europe. Why would our budget impact that? Or in Japan or Australia? You know, but presidents like to take credit. So if inflation is going bad, guess who's going to get the blame for that? And he better not complain about it. Yeah. So I would argue he has gotten legislation passed more than Trump did, for sure. I'm surprised because very few legislation is passed. You're absolutely right. We've seen government by executive order.
Right.
Right? And that means that when the next president comes in, it changes. There's no bipartisan consensus to get
Right.
something done that holds up for a long period of time.
And don't you think a lot of things that he's been in there has been by executive order, more than a lot of
No.
vice presidents?
No. If you take a look at executive orders, the number of executive orders by president has shrank. It went down. It went down significantly during the second Bush administration, and it went down significantly during the Obama administration. They just weren't issuing them. Then it started to tick up a little bit in the Trump administration, and it's ticked up a little bit in the Biden administration, but not like it was during the FDR administration, during the Reagan administration. For some reason, people started doing less of that. I'm not sure why, but it's not good policy either way. No, it's bad policy making. So I tend to think when I look at Biden, Biden should have pulled a Polk. He should have said, I'm a one-term president. This is what I want to accomplish.
Yeah.
I want to do this, I want to do this, and I want to do this. Good luck in the future. And then you would have walked away. You go, I accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish. I'm good.
I mean, maybe he just waited, he finally got it after waiting so long, he doesn't want to give it up.
Yeah, he's probably like King Charles in that regard, right? King Charles waited until he's like 75. He goes, I'm going to be king as long as I can. No, I also think that for presidents, just like any other office, is that you tend to think that they can't not go on without you, right? That you're so essential. I'm sure Joe Biden thinks that, right? He thinks, I'm the only one who can beat Donald Trump. No, that's probably not true. And Trump's probably thinking, I'm the only person that can do this for America. No, probably not true. You know, there's a lot of other good people out there. But, you know, the cemetery's full of, non-dispensable people. Because all of us could be replaced. Yeah, I think that's the case. But I think that would have been the case. Well, while you mentioned that, let's just talk about this for a second. Do you like your presidential candidates?
I have problems with both of them, but I don't want to get into politics here, but I know who I'm voting for if that
Sure.
comes down to it.
Yeah, I do too. I know who I'm going to vote for if it comes down to it, right?
Because of my political affiliation.
I may not like a choice, but they're not equal choices, what I would say. I've had that debate with some friends thinking, well, they're both horrible candidates. I go, but they're not equally as horrible. You know, that's a question. So if you don't like the candidates, can I tell you who I blame for that?
Us.
Yes. And I blame the parties. Because up until about the 1970s, parties picked candidates.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to be honest with me. If the major parties behind closed doors, let's say the elected officials of the major parties in Congress, right? If they could pick their presidential candidate, would the Republicans have picked Trump?
No.
No.
I don't know.
No.
No.
They would have gone, you're 78, we went through all that stuff when you were president, where we were turning over Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, it was too much for us, we don't like it, we want something else, you've got 91 indictments, we don't want that either, you're dragging us down, you've lost us a lot of congressional elections, we want somebody else. They would have gone with Tim Scott, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis. They would have find somebody younger too.
Yeah.
Would the Democrats have gone with Joe Biden?
And I think Joe
No.
Biden's too old.
They would go, dude, you're 82 years
I know,
old.
That's right.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
Right.
We've got people waiting in the wings. We've got the California governor. We've got the Michigan governor. We've got some really good Democrats out here. See you later. But because in the 1970s, parties decided to make the primary system and awarding delegates that way to win the election, means that now your candidates, and we're voting right now for presidential candidates, how many choices do you have? Ron DeSantis has dropped out for the Republicans. He's gone, right?
Haley's still
Well,
there.
Yeah,
the only one in there. and she-
right. All the other ones are gone.
Yeah.
Because the voters in Iowa and the voters in New Hampshire have eliminated all those people for you.
Yeah.
And in New Hampshire, for example, because Trump had competition, he won, I think, 45% of that vote, with only 15% of Republicans voting. Which means he won that nomination and knocked out people with about 7.5% of the vote. And then no one ran against Joe Biden in his primary. Because the Democrats know he's probably too old, they'd like to see somebody else, but you don't run against a sitting member.
Yeah, but don't you think part of the problem with Biden's administration right now is that he's not making all the decisions, there's other people up there giving him.
Trump wasn't making his decisions either.
Well, I'd say that, we said that about Eisenhower. Yeah, I don't know, right? I don't know. And people say that Biden's losing it. I don't know. I do know this. If the party, if the White House was concerned about that, or they thought it wasn't true, he would do a lot more press conferences.
Yeah.
But they don't put him in press conferences,
Right.
right?
Or one-on-one interviews.
Yeah, they don't do that because, for one, Joe Biden's always been a gaffe machine.
Yeah, he
You know,
has.
his whole life. And now, you know, the guy's 82.
Yeah, I know.
It's a tough job. It's a really tough job to do. So,
That's what I'm saying.
I think that's, I think the problem is that voters are selecting these people, and it's a small percentage of the voters. Most of them are gone before you and I get a chance to pick who we'd really like to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah. So we have a couple of those kind of problems. Let me give you some hints on some presidents who are moving up. One of those presidents moving up is Grant. Grant used to be at the very bottom of the presidents. Grant has been moving up. Why has Grant been moving up? If you'd gone back around 1900 and asked people, and I think it was Teddy Roosevelt that said, he goes, the three greatest Americans that ever lived were Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. Because Grant wins the war, and Grant does more for civil rights than any other president until Lyndon Johnson. But what happens? Well, in the early 1900s, the lost cause mythology takes hold, which was that the Confederate States weren't really fighting for slavery. They were. And that the South never had a chance of winning. Yes, they did. They almost did. And they were always outnumbered. No, they weren't. But all that took place, and that the only reason that the North won is they had more men and more machinery, and Grant was a butcher, and Grant was a drunk, and so Grant dropped all the way down into modern history. Only recently has Grant's scholarship been really moving forward, and he's been moving back up from what he's done. Yeah. So there is mobility within the polling, but not a great mobility. We're not going to see very many presidents who are near the bottom move all the way to the top, right? And by the way, you head down George Bush Jr., he is, he's 17th from the bottom. So he's in the bottom 50. Although I think he'll continue to move up a little bit. The war in Iraq was a mistake. He even admits that now, right? That probably should have done that. Afghanistan turned out to be a disaster. But I would argue that the prescription drug plan that he came up with was a great piece of legislation. No Child Left Behind was well-intended legislation. I think his leadership, when he's on the top of that rubble at the end of 9/11, giving in that speech, was inspiring leadership. So I think that that's one that can move up or down. So, yes. So, I think that's about all I have to say. Unless you have some questions about specific presidents that you'd like to know. Like, who's the only president that English was their second language? They didn't speak English first. born under the American flag? Same person. All right. It is, of course, your friend and mine, one-term president, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren's original language is Dutch. He's from New York, a place called Kinderhook, New York, which was a Dutch community where everybody spoke Dutch. So if we ever get to see a movie like we did with Oppenheimer called Van Buren, which we'll never see because it'd be incredibly boring, he'd have to have a strong Dutch accent. And again, here's another guy. He takes over for Jackson, so he's living in a big shadow of Andrew Jackson, right? This larger-life guy. And as soon as he takes office, the economy crashes and goes into depression as soon as he takes office. So how much of it was his fault?
All of it by the public view.
Right. And that'll bring me back over to Trump, because when Trump left office, unemployment's at 15%. He spent more money in 4 years than Obama did in 8 years into the deficit. But there's a difference. The difference is what?
COVID.
COVID, right? COVID hits. Do you not do anything? Do you not spend the money? Do you not send out money to people who need it? Yeah, COVID hit. So it's that reaction on a crisis that may affect how much deficit spending you're doing. Absolutely. I think that's an issue. So, all right, questions. I've been talking for an hour. Go ahead.
I'm trying not to be too partisan.
No, be as partisan as you want. It's what makes things fun. It's what's lacking in the United States today is that people with partisan differences can't sit down and have a conversation without worrying about it. Right? We can do that.
People of goodwill should agree.
That's right. Reagan had beers with Tip O'Neill.
Yeah, and had a great working relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel, and I don't know if I can put it happened now or it happened at this time. I feel that when we evaluate both Trump and Biden, that our national media has totally taken sides, and that there is not an objectiveness. I mean,
That's why from a historian's point of view, you wait 20 years.
yeah, you want to wait 20 or maybe in this
Yeah.
case longer. But I do think that some of the things that are negative about Trump are just, beaten to death. Remember, Trump was walking down a ramp someplace and had a little bit of a stumble or lost his balance momentarily, recovered and walked down. And the media spent 2 weeks talking about the 25th Amendment, in other words, how to get a mentally incapacitated president out. And Biden does things all the time, and crickets. Nobody says anything.
Seriously? I would disagree, because it's in the news all the time.
Mainstream media. I'm not
No.
talking about
No, even mainstream
commentators on
media. I
Fox.
read a lot about it in the mainstream media. I read a lot about it in the mainstream media. Washington Post, New York Times, Dallas Morning News, The Economist.
That's just starting to happen though in the last, 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, I would say since the campaign has ramped up, it's become more pronounced. Yeah, certainly, I think that's
But
true.
we've had signs before that, and when I compare that to the Trump's losing his step there on this ramp versus ignoring some of Biden's things, and I don't want to get into this, that, he did this, he said, but I do think that we are lacking severely a good, unbiased national media.
I can't tell you if that's true or not. I don't know.
It's opinions.
Yeah, I know. One thing is about is when I tell my students, when I say, is the media biased, they say yes. And I go, I don't believe you. And the reason I don't believe you is because you're biased. Right? And we all have filters, and stories that we like, we accept that as good reporting. Stories we don't like, we tend to dismiss that as, well, that's slanted, that's biased reporting. We all do that. It's called confirmation bias, right?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Right, because when people tell me bad things about people I don't necessarily like, I'm more likely to believe them.
Yeah.
When they tell me good things about me, I'm more likely to believe them. And that's confirmation on my bias on my part. I think what's going to hurt Trump in the long haul is the 91 indictments. I think January 6th is going to hurt him. I think the writings of his cabinet members, like Rex Tillerson and other people who said that he was an idiot and he was stupid, are going to hurt him. I think those will be things that historians will look at, not so much the media reports. Because the media does, it depends on where you're watching, whether it's biased or not, right? And
To a certain extent, but I think it's far one direction than the other.
I don't know, maybe. I can't tell I'm biased. I can't tell.
You're biased, but you're honest.
I don't know. I mean, I read foreign magazines, a lot of foreign news, because I want to get into
I'm sorry. What was
foreign. Like I subscribe to the French newspaper Le Monde, the British magazine The Economist, so I could get a different point of view.
that?
Yeah.
I read the Telegraph.
I'm sorry. Stop
And the
telling me.
Times.
I just can't do
It's
it.
my confirmation
I
bias.
can't do it anymore. I can't do the Star Telegram anymore. I've tried. So I don't keep up with the Tarrant County News as much as I should. But yeah, I think, like, again, there's always going to be a reevaluation of presidents. But I think being impeached twice, the indictments, being found liable for rape, I think those things are going to be things that historians will look at, certainly, and just in terms of raw numbers. Because the number of presidents have been indicted, well, Bill Clinton, right, he got impeached. That's hurting him, right? No matter how much Bill Clinton likes to write in his autobiography, it's a badge of honor. It's not a badge of honor, Bill. You lied to everybody. You absolutely lied to everybody. I'm sorry. But it just, I think those things are always going to hurt or haunt Trump. That could change. If he wins re-election, that could change. Yeah, that brings a different story to it. But if he doesn't win re-election, then what is he? He's a loser, right? When you lose, you're a loser. Joe Biden doesn't win, he's going to drop significantly, right? People go, look, he's a one-term president. He probably shouldn't have ran again, but he did, and there we are. Yeah. Again, I would argue that both parties would rather have somebody different.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I would take a younger guy, 70. There's got some young blood in there somewhere along the way. Because remember, with Obama and Bush, we had 44-year-olds.
Yeah.
And Clinton was 40-something years old.
Yeah.
We were actually people were worried about Ronald Reagan when he was 68. Where are we going?
Yeah.
You know, it's time for some new leadership. I would argue that's
I agree
true.
with that. I mean, look at our Congress too. Nancy
Exactly.
Pelosi entered the House of Representatives in 1980. Think about what you were doing in 1980.
Graduating high school.
And there's
Well-
others. I'm not just saying her example, but that's across the board.
Yeah, Chuck Grassley, the Republican out of Iowa, he's 89 years old and just won re-election.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Strom Thurmond out of South Carolina was 96 when they re-voted him back into office. 96! He made it to 100. He wheeled him out of the hospital for votes.
Yeah. No,
That's
that's
ridiculous.
More recently, Dianne Feinstein,
Oh,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Completely out of it.
Yeah,
Completely.
someone whispering in her ear how to vote.
Right. It's amazing that we just need to sort of, people feel like they can't be replaced. Yes, you can. Go away. Well, thank you. Wave your goodbye. Yeah, you can be replaced. So it's difficult.
How did we get here? Because, you know, I mean, yeah, Strom Thurmond, when he was an old gaffer, and I can say that because I am an old gaffer myself, but when he was a really old gaffer, I mean, he sort of stood out. Whereas now, it's almost like the standard, or it's becoming the standard to have 70, 80, and late 80s people in some of these jobs.
Well, I
don't
think,
know.
and maybe it's me being cynical at some point. I'm usually not. I think a lot of root of that is money.
Oh, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, ever since, for example, the Citizen United decision, and the creation of super PACs, where you can have these people donating millions of dollars, they don't have to report their names, you don't know where it's being spent.
Yep.
I think money has always been a corrupting influence in politics.
And always will be.
Yeah, I mean,
It's just worse now.
you could, I don't ever buy the fact that you can't do anything about it, right? When we have gun violence, people go, well, there's nothing we can do. Well, there's always something you can do. I don't know what it is, but we just shouldn't just say there's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
Or if we say there's nothing we can do about money in politics, I'd say, maybe we ought to at least think about it, right?
right.
I mean,
I agree.
you could say, Britain allows very little campaign spending. campaigns can start 30 days or 45 days before the election, and then they have to stop. That limits the amount. You could also do have public funding of campaigns. Say each candidate gets $250,000 for Congress. That's it. And you don't get money from outside. No one else can do anything for you. You've got to go run. I also think that getting rid of gerrymandering and allowing more competitive districts would help.
Yeah, that would be a big thing.
I think ranked choice voting would help.
What choice?
Ranked choice voting.
I don't know. I have not quite made up my mind on that one.
It could help. I mean, again, I'm saying we shouldn't just say if nothing can help. We got to at least
Sure.
try.
I also don't like the fact that when you have a Senate race and 90% of the money comes from out of state,
Yeah.
you know, for that campaign, it's like, wait a minute.
And not to mention that, you know, you talk about in Texas. Let's just hit Texas. In our off-year elections, we're electing governor. We're number 50th in voter turnout.
Wow, that's amazing.
All right. Ted Cruz is your senator for good or bad because David Dewhurst beat him in the primary election by 45 to 35% of the vote. But that's not a majority. So they had to go to a runoff, which was held in July, where very few people voted. And Ted Cruz won. He won really, I would say, this job as senator with maybe about 5% of the people actually voted for him. That's not Ted Cruz's fault.
Yeah,
That's our fault.
that's right.
And, I mean, when you go back and look at it, you probably didn't want David Dewhurst when you saw the spiral the former lieutenant governor went into. I think he was arrested on the street at one point after being beat up by his girlfriend. I mean,
Yeah.
he just went, he went someplace, and I don't know where it was, and it was not good. So, Ted Cruz has probably ended up being better than David Dewhurst. The problem is that nobody likes Ted Cruz.
Oh, that's true.
I think Lindsey Graham said that you could shoot Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and there'd be no eyewitnesses. But he's brilliant. He's a very brilliant guy. I always say like Alexander Hamilton. Nobody liked Hamilton, but he was a brilliant guy. And Ted Cruz isn't stupid. Yeah, he is not stupid in any shape or form. He's one of the few people that I would say is a constitutional scholar and knows what he's talking about when it comes to the Constitution, whether I agree with it or not. Doesn't matter, but he does know. All right, any other questions? Because now I've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes. And I can talk all night long.
You need to refill your drink.
I could. I'll wrap it up here, because when they do these rankings of presidents, they do it under crisis leadership, they look at it under economic management, they have moral authority, and your highest ranking presidents who had moral authority were Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Roosevelt, Obama, and Jimmy Carter is in the top of moral authority. Because we can argue that Jimmy Carter may not have been a good president, but people knew that he was a good Christian man, right? And a good man doesn't necessarily make a good president,
Right.
right? It doesn't necessarily do it. And at the bottom of our moral authority, I hate to tell you this, but Donald Trump is near, it's the bottom. Then James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and then Richard Nixon. So it's the same cast of characters that we see ranking up here at the bottom right now. We'll see how that changes. They look at their administrative skills, international relations, and pursuit for equal justice for them all, for everybody. So I think there's a lot of ways you can measure a president. So with that, I will stop because I'm tired and I've got a show to do tomorrow. And my arm's hurting me a little bit. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Brian.
Kenneth, you missed the interaction part where we had our own little nameplates and